There's a version of hell most people would pay to enter. And in December 2002, a 55-year-old grandfather from West Virginia did exactly that. His name was Jack Whittaker, and on Christmas morning, he won the largest undivided lottery jackpot in American history, $315 million. He chose the lump sum. After taxes, he walked away with $113 million in cash. He was already a millionaire. He owned a construction company. He had a stable life, a loving family, a good reputation. He didn't need the money, but he bought the ticket anyway. And when he won, he thought his life had just been upgraded. What he didn't realize was that he had just signed the death certificate for everything he loved. 5 years later, his granddaughter was dead. His daughter followed shortly after. His marriage collapsed. His fortune evaporated. He was robbed, sued, stalked, and stripped of nearly everything. And in interviews near the end of his life, Jack said something that still echoes in the quietest corners of the internet. "I wish I'd torn that ticket up." Now you might be thinking this is just another lottery curse story, another reckless person who couldn't handle success. But Jack's story isn't about stupidity. It's not even really about the lottery. It's about something far more dangerous. Something that most of us carry but never examine until it's too late. It's about what happens when your identity, your relationships, and your sense of control are suddenly ripped away and replaced with a single overwhelming force: money. And here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. You don't need to win the lottery for this to happen to you. You just need a windfall, an inheritance, a business exit, a sudden promotion, a settlement, anything that gives you more money than your current character can manage. Because money doesn't change you, it reveals you. It amplifies what's already there. And if what's already there is unexamined ego, unhealed relationships, or undisciplined habits, then more money doesn't solve your problems. It multiplies them. Jack Whittaker didn't lose his life because he won money. He lost it because the money exposed every crack that was already in the foundation. And once those cracks widened, everything collapsed. So this isn't a story about lottery tickets. It's a story about you, about me, about what happens when we assume that external wealth can create internal peace. It can't. And the faster the wealth comes, the faster the destruction follows, unless you've built something real underneath. Over the next hour or so, we're going to walk through Jack's story step by step, not to judge him, but to learn from him, to see where the fractures started, to understand the psychological traps that sudden wealth creates, and most importantly, to recognize those same traps in our own lives before we ever face that kind of pressure. Because whether you're chasing a big payday, expecting an inheritance, or just trying to build wealth slowly, the principles are the same. Money is a magnifier, and if you haven't done the inner work, the outer reward will destroy you. You're listening to Asset Audiobooks, where we don't just talk about money. We talk about the person holding it. And by the end of this, you'll understand why Jack's $315 million mistake wasn't the lottery ticket. It was believing that the money mattered more than the man. Let's begin. Jack Whittaker wasn't supposed to be a cautionary tale. If anything, he was supposed to be proof that the lottery could work, that someone responsible could win and handle it well. He wasn't some broke dreamer buying scratch-offs with his last $5. He was a self-made businessman. He'd built Diversified Enterprises Construction from the ground up. By the time he won the lottery, his company was pulling in about $17 million a year. He had over 100 employees. He owned property. He had investments. He understood contracts, payroll, risk management. In other words, Jack already knew how to handle money, or at least he thought he did. And that's the first crack in the foundation. Competence in one area doesn't automatically transfer to another. You can be brilliant at running a construction company and completely unprepared for managing a 9-figure liquid fortune that everyone in the world suddenly knows about. But Jack didn't see it that way. When he won, he stood in front of the cameras and said all the right things. He was calm, grateful. He talked about giving to charity. He mentioned his church. He said he wanted to help people. He even set up a foundation. On paper, he did everything right. And that's what makes his story so terrifying, because this wasn't a failure of intelligence. It was a failure of identity. See, when you build wealth slowly, your identity grows with it. You develop habits. You learn to say no. You get used to people asking you for money, and you build boundaries. You make mistakes on a smaller scale and recover. You integrate the wealth into who you are, piece by piece. But when wealth comes all at once, there's no integration. There's just explosion. Your old identity doesn't fit anymore, and you haven't had time to build a new one. So you're walking around in a life that doesn't match the person you were yesterday, and everyone around you feels it too. Jack went from being a respected local businessman to a national celebrity overnight. And with that came something he wasn't ready for: access. Suddenly, he had access to anything he wanted. Any car, any house, any experience. And more dangerously, anyone who wanted something from him now had access to him. Within weeks, he was being approached by strangers. Old friends he hadn't spoken to in decades. Distant relatives, lawyers, investors, ministries, nonprofits. People with ideas, people with problems, people with needs. And Jack, to his credit, wanted to help. He gave millions to his church. He donated to local causes. He funded scholarships. He tried to be generous. But generosity without boundaries isn't virtue, it's vulnerability. Because here's what nobody tells you about sudden wealth: people stop seeing you as a person. You become a resource. And once that shift happens, every relationship in your life gets reevaluated through a single lens. What can I get from this person? Jack's friendships changed. His family dynamics shifted. People who used to treat him as an equal now treated him as a solution. And the tragedy is, he didn't notice it happening. Or maybe he did and he didn't know how to stop it. There's a psychological term for this: role distortion. It's when your role in other people's lives changes so drastically that the relationship itself becomes unrecognizable. You're no longer a husband, a father, a friend. You're a benefactor, a target, a symbol. And once that distortion sets in, intimacy dies, because intimacy requires equality. It requires being seen for who you are, not what you have. And when you're worth $100 million, very few people can see past that number. Jack's wife, Jewel, started to feel it. His daughter started to feel it. And his granddaughter, Brandy, a teenage girl who suddenly had access to infinite money and infinite attention, started to spiral. But we'll come back to Brandy, because her story is where everything truly breaks. For now, let's talk about what happened to Jack's mind. He started carrying hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash, just in his car, in a briefcase, sometimes in a duffel bag. He'd go to strip clubs and hand out $1,000 bills like they were business cards. He'd drink, he'd gamble, he'd get into altercations. He was arrested multiple times. His name started appearing in police reports. Now you might ask why. Why would a previously stable man suddenly start acting reckless? And the answer is simpler than you think. He was trying to feel something. Because when you have enough money to solve every material problem, you lose the friction that makes life feel real. There's no challenge, no stakes, no earned reward. So you start chasing intensity. You start testing boundaries, not because you're evil, but because you're numb. And numbness, when you're not used to it, feels like death. Jack wasn't destroying his life on purpose. He was trying to prove to himself that he was still alive, that he still mattered, that he was more than just a wallet with a heartbeat. But every attempt to feel something real only made things worse, because he was using money to solve an emotional problem. And money can't do that. It never could. Let's talk about what happens when you become the answer to everyone else's problems. Within months of winning, Jack was drowning in requests, and not just requests, expectations, demands, entitlement. People he'd never met showed up at his house. Letters poured in by the thousands, sob stories, business proposals, threats. Some were heartbreaking, some were absurd, some were manipulative. But all of them had one thing in common. They believed Jack owed them something. And here's the trap. When you're a good person and you suddenly have the resources to help, you feel guilty for saying no. Every request feels like a test of your character. If you say no, does that make you selfish, greedy, cold? So you say yes, over and over, until you realize that no amount of giving will ever be enough, because the need is infinite and you are not. Jack tried to manage it by setting up the Jack Whittaker Foundation. He pledged millions. He partnered with churches and schools. He tried to create systems, but systems require boundaries, and boundaries require the ability to disappoint people. And Jack couldn't do that, not consistently. Because deep down, he wanted to be loved. He wanted to be seen as the hero, the good guy, the generous millionaire who changed lives. But that desire made him a target. There's a concept in psychology called the savior complex. It's when you derive your sense of worth from rescuing others, and it feels noble, it feels righteous, but it's actually a form of control. Because when you need to be needed, you can't let people stand on their own. You keep them dependent. And that dependency becomes toxic for everyone involved. Jack's giving wasn't always clean. Sometimes it was genuine. Sometimes it was guilt. Sometimes it was image management. And sometimes it was just easier to write a check than to have a hard conversation. But the people around him started to sense that. They realized that if they applied the right pressure, they could get what they wanted. And once that pattern established itself, Jack lost his agency. He wasn't choosing to give. He was being extracted from. His family felt it most. Brandy, his granddaughter, was 16 when Jack won the lottery. She was a normal kid, a little wild maybe, but normal. And then overnight she had access to unlimited money. No job, no responsibility, no structure, just cash, attention, and freedom. Jack gave her an allowance. Thousands of dollars a week. He bought her cars. He paid for her friends. He wanted her to be happy. He wanted to be the grandfather who could give her everything. But what he actually gave her was a life without consequences. And a life without consequences is a life without meaning. Brandy started using drugs. She started running with dangerous people. She'd disappear for days. She'd get into trouble and Jack would bail her out, literally. He'd pay her legal fees. He'd pay off the people she owed. He'd cover her mistakes, and every time he did, he thought he was protecting her. But what he was really doing was enabling her. He was teaching her that money could erase problems, that she didn't need to grow up, that someone would always be there to fix things. Until one day, no one could. In December 2004, just 2 years after Jack won the lottery, Brandy's body was found behind a junked van, wrapped in a sheet. She'd overdosed. She was 17 years old. The coroner's report said it was drugs. But anyone paying attention knew it was more than that. It was the weight of too much too soon with no foundation underneath. Jack was destroyed. He blamed himself. He blamed the money. He blamed the people around her. And he was right. All of it was true. But here's the part that's hard to say and harder to hear. Brandy's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a symptom of a family system that had been quietly breaking long before the lottery ticket was ever scratched, because money didn't create the dysfunction. It just gave it rocket fuel. Jack's daughter, Ginger, Brandy's mother, was already struggling. She had her own battles, her own pain. And when Brandy died, Ginger didn't have the tools to survive it. She spiraled. She drank. She withdrew. And in 2009, just a few years after Brandy, Ginger was found dead too. 2 deaths. 2 people Jack loved more than anything. Both gone. Both in the shadow of that lottery ticket. And Jack, the man who once had everything, was left alone in a mansion he didn't want, surrounded by money that had cost him everything that mattered. People say the lottery ruined Jack Whittaker, but that's not quite right. The lottery revealed that Jack, like most of us, had built his life on things that couldn't bear the weight of sudden fortune. Love that wasn't communicated, boundaries that were never set, pain that was never processed. And when the money came, it didn't fix any of that. It just made all of it louder. There's a fantasy most of us carry. We don't talk about it much, but it's there, quietly humming in the background of our ambitions. It goes like this: if I could just get enough money, I could start over. I could leave behind the mess, the mistakes, the broken relationships, the bad habits. I could become the person I was always meant to be. It's a beautiful thought, and it's completely wrong, because money doesn't give you a clean start. It gives you a faster car on the same road you were already traveling. And if that road was heading toward a cliff, well, now you're just going to get there quicker. Jack believed in the clean start. He thought the money would let him rise above the noise, that he could be more generous, more respected, more in control. And for a brief moment, it felt true. He was on magazine covers. He was interviewed on national television. He stood in front of his church and handed over a check for millions. He was celebrated. But beneath the surface, nothing had changed. His relationship with his wife was still strained. His communication with his daughter was still distant. His granddaughter was still searching for love in all the wrong places. And Jack himself was still the same man he'd always been, just with a much bigger stage and a much smaller margin for error. The myth of the clean start is seductive because it lets us avoid the hardest work, dealing with who we actually are. It's easier to believe that external change will create internal transformation, that a new job, a new city, a new bank account will somehow make us different people. But it doesn't work that way. You take yourself with you, every unresolved issue, every unhealed wound, every undisciplined habit. And when the money comes, those things don't disappear. They metastasize. Jack's drinking, which had always been present but manageable, became a problem. His temper, which he'd always been able to control in professional settings, started flaring in public. His judgment, which had served him well in business, began to falter when it came to people. He trusted the wrong ones. He ignored the right ones. He threw money at problems that needed attention, not cash, and every mistake compounded. In 2003, less than a year after winning, thieves broke into his car outside a strip club and stole over $500,000 in cash, just sitting there, in a vehicle, unguarded. When the news broke, people were stunned. Not just that he'd been robbed, but that he was carrying that kind of money around in the first place. What was he thinking? But that's the point. He wasn't thinking. He was reacting. He was operating from a place of emotional chaos, not strategic clarity. And when you're in that state, you make decisions that seem insane to everyone else but feel perfectly reasonable to you in the moment. Jack later said he didn't even care about the money. And maybe that's true. Maybe by that point, the money had already lost its meaning. It had stopped being a tool and started being a weight, a reminder, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. He was sued dozens of times by former employees, by business partners, by people claiming he'd promised them money, by casinos, by contractors. Some of the lawsuits were legitimate. Some were opportunistic, but all of them drained him. Financially, yes, but more than that, emotionally. Because every lawsuit was another reminder that people didn't see him as Jack anymore. They saw him as a lottery winner, a mark, a source of extraction. And that isolation, that sense of being perpetually misunderstood and used, is one of the hidden costs of sudden wealth that nobody talks about. You can be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone, because none of them are relating to you. They're relating to your money. Jack's marriage, which had survived decades of normal life, couldn't survive this. Jewel, his wife, watched the man she married disappear into someone she didn't recognize. The drinking, the recklessness, the constant chaos, the grief over brandy, the fear over ginger. She tried to hold on. But there's only so much one person can absorb. And by the mid-2000s, their marriage was effectively over, even if the paperwork hadn't been filed yet. Jack had everything he thought he wanted and nothing that actually mattered. And the cruelest part, he knew it. In interviews, you can see it in his eyes. The regret, the exhaustion, the wish that he could go back. But you can't go back. You can only go forward. And Jack didn't know how to do that anymore. Let's talk about something uncomfortable. Something that sounds wrong to say out loud but is absolutely true. Generosity, when it's not rooted in wisdom, can destroy people. We're taught that giving is good, that helping others is noble, and it is. But like anything else, context matters, motive matters, boundaries matter. And Jack's generosity, while well-intentioned, became one of the most destructive forces in his life. He gave millions away, to churches, to strangers, to friends, to family. And on the surface, that sounds admirable, but let's look closer. When Jack gave money to his church, it came with conditions. He wanted control over how it was used. He wanted recognition. He wanted influence. And when things didn't go the way he expected, he felt betrayed. He felt used. But here's the question nobody asked him. Why are you giving? Are you giving because you genuinely want to help, with no expectation of return? Or are you giving because you want to be seen a certain way? Because you want to feel important? Because you're trying to earn love, respect, or loyalty? If it's the latter, then you're not being generous. You're negotiating. And the moment the other person doesn't hold up their end of a deal they never agreed to, you feel cheated. Jack felt cheated a lot. He gave his family money, lots of it. And then he resented them when they didn't use it the way he thought they should. He gave to people in need, and then felt angry when they came back asking for more. He funded projects, and then felt betrayed when those projects didn't succeed or didn't acknowledge him properly. This is what happens when generosity is tied to identity. When being the generous one becomes who you are, you can't afford for people to not need you. You can't afford for your gifts to not matter. Because if they don't, then who are you? And so you keep giving. Not because it's helping, but because stopping would mean confronting the emptiness underneath. There's a story Jack told in an interview years later. He was at a gas station and a woman approached him. She recognized him. She told him her son was sick. She needed money for treatment. Jack, without hesitation, gave her $10,000. Cash. Right there. He didn't verify her story. He didn't ask questions. He just gave. When the interviewer asked him why, Jack said, "Because I could." But that's not really an answer. That's an abdication of responsibility. Because when you have the power to change someone's life with money, you also have the responsibility to think about whether that change will actually help them or just create dependency. Jack didn't think about that. He just reacted. And that reaction, repeated thousands of times, is part of what drained his fortune and his spirit. Because here's the truth. You can't save people by giving them money. You can help them, yes. You can provide opportunity. You can remove obstacles. But saving someone requires that they do the internal work. And money can't do that for them. In fact, money often prevents that work from happening. When you give someone everything, you rob them of the struggle that builds character. You rob them of agency. You teach them that the solution is always external, that someone else will fix it, that they don't have to grow. Jack did this with Brandy. He gave her money every time she was in trouble, and every time she learned that trouble wasn't something she had to solve. It was something Grandpa would handle, until he couldn't. He did it with friends who had business ideas. He'd fund them. And when the businesses failed, which most did, those friendships failed too. Because the foundation was transactional, not relational. He did it with his church. He gave millions and then felt alienated when the church continued to ask for more, or when leadership decisions were made without his input. He wanted gratitude. He wanted deference. He wanted his generosity to buy him a seat at the table, but that's not how it works. Generosity that expects something in return isn't generosity, it's investment. And when the return doesn't come, the resentment does. Now, let's be clear. Jack wasn't a villain. He wasn't trying to manipulate people. He was trying to be good, but he was doing it from a broken place. A place of unprocessed grief, unchecked ego, and unexamined need. And that's the lesson here. Before you give, you have to ask yourself, why am I doing this? What do I actually expect? Am I prepared for this gift to disappear into someone else's life without changing anything? Am I okay with not being thanked? Am I okay with being forgotten? If the answer is no, then you're not ready to give. You're ready to trade. And trades require contracts, boundaries, clear terms. Jack had none of that. He just gave and gave and gave, hoping it would fill the hole inside him, hoping it would make people love him, hoping it would prove that the money hadn't ruined him. But it didn't work, because the hole wasn't about money. It was about meaning, about connection, about identity. And no amount of giving was ever going to fix that. By 2007, just 5 years after winning, Jack had lost most of his fortune. Not to taxes, not to bad investments, but to lawsuits, theft, handouts, and chaos. The foundation he set up was drained. His businesses were struggling. His family was shattered. And the man who once had $113 million was left sitting in the ruins, asking the same question we all eventually ask when we chase the wrong things. What was it all for? The answer, painful as it is this. It was for nothing. Because he spent 5 years trying to use money to solve problems that money can't touch. And in the process, he lost everything that actually mattered. But here's the thing. Jack's story isn't over yet. Because even in the wreckage, there are lessons, patterns, warnings, and if we're paying attention, we can learn them without having to live them. There's a moment in every broken story where trust stops being the default and becomes the exception. Where you stop assuming people mean well and start assuming they want something. For Jack, that moment didn't arrive all at once. It crept in, slowly, quietly, like rot in the foundation of a house you thought was solid. It started with small things. Friends who only called when they needed money. Relatives who suddenly remembered birthdays they'd ignored for years. Strangers who showed up with stories so rehearsed they almost sounded real. At first, Jack tried to give people the benefit of the doubt. He wanted to believe that most people were good. That they weren't just coming to him because of the money. That the relationships were still real. But over time, the evidence became impossible to ignore. There was the business partner who tried to sue him for a deal they'd never actually formalized. The contractor who inflated invoices, assuming Jack wouldn't check. The so-called financial advisor who recommended investments that just happened to pay the advisor massive commissions. Each betrayal was small enough to rationalize. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe they didn't mean it that way. Maybe he was being paranoid. But then came the ones that couldn't be rationalized. One of Jack's closest friends, someone he'd known for decades, borrowed a significant sum of money. It wasn't a gift. It was a loan, clear terms, handshake agreement. The kind of thing that should have been simple between people who trusted each other. The friend never paid it back, didn't even try. And when Jack brought it up, the friend acted offended, as if Jack asking for his own money back was a betrayal of the friendship. That moment broke something in Jack, because it clarified what he'd been trying not to see. The friendship wasn't real. Maybe it never had been. Or maybe it had been real once, but the money had rewritten the entire relationship, and neither of them had noticed until it was too late. This is what sudden wealth does. It doesn't just change how people see you. It changes how you see them. And once you start questioning people's motives, it's almost impossible to stop. Every compliment becomes suspect. Every invitation feels like a setup. Every conversation gets filtered through the same question. What do they really want? And the tragedy is, sometimes you're wrong. Sometimes people are being genuine. But by the time you've been burned enough, you can't tell the difference anymore. So you assume the worst. You build walls. You isolate. Jack started doing that. He stopped answering calls. He avoided public places. He became suspicious, cynical, guarded. The man who had once been open and generous became closed and defensive. And the people who might have actually cared, the ones who weren't after anything, started to pull away too. Because nobody wants to be treated like a threat. Nobody wants to constantly prove they're not using you. So Jack ended up surrounded by two types of people. Those who wanted something from him and those who were paid to be there. Lawyers, accountants, security, transactional relationships, professional distances. He had money, he had staff, but he didn't have anyone he could actually trust. And that kind of loneliness is suffocating. There's a concept in psychology called betrayal trauma. It's the deep wound that happens when someone you trusted uses that trust against you. And it doesn't just hurt in the moment. It rewires your brain. It makes you hypervigilant. It makes you expect betrayal even when it's not there. Jack was living in a constant state of betrayal trauma. And it wasn't just from strangers. It was from family, from friends, from institutions he thought he could rely on. His church, the one he'd given millions to, became a source of tension. There were disagreements about how the money was being used. Jack felt sidelined. He felt like his contributions were being taken for granted. And whether that perception was accurate or not, it deepened his sense of isolation. Even his marriage, the one relationship that had survived everything else, was fracturing under the weight of mistrust. Not necessarily mistrust between Jack and Jewel, but mistrust of the world around them. The constant pressure, the constant intrusion. The feeling that they were always being watched, always being judged, always being used. Jewel later said that the money didn't just change Jack. It changed everyone around him. And she was right. Because when someone in your life suddenly has massive wealth, the entire relational ecosystem shifts. Power dynamics change, expectations shift, resentments build, and unless everyone involved is emotionally mature enough to navigate that shift, the relationships collapse. Jack and Jewel had been married for decades. They'd built a life together, raised a family, survived hard times, but this was different. This wasn't a challenge they could work through together. This was a flood that swept both of them away in different directions. Jewel watched her husband spiral. She watched him drink more, gamble more, act out in ways that seemed completely unlike the man she'd married. And she didn't know how to reach him anymore, because he wasn't the same person. The money had changed him, or maybe it had just revealed parts of him that were always there, buried under the structure of normal life. Either way, the man she knew was gone. And the man who remained was a stranger. By 2009, the same year his daughter Ginger died, Jack and Jewel's marriage was effectively over. They separated, not with anger or drama, but with exhaustion. The kind of quiet ending that happens when two people realize they don't have anything left to give. Jack was alone, truly alone. His granddaughter dead, his daughter dead, his wife gone, his friends either absent or suspect. His fortune mostly gone, drained by lawsuits and poor decisions, and the sheer cost of trying to survive in a world that had turned hostile. And all of it, every single piece of the collapse, could be traced back to one thing: the destruction of trust. Because once trust is gone, everything else falls apart. Love can't survive without it. Friendship can't exist without it. Even business relationships require some baseline of mutual reliability. And Jack had lost that, not because he was a bad person, but because the money had placed him in a position where trust became impossible, where every relationship was contaminated by suspicion, where he couldn't afford to be wrong about people, so he stopped letting people in at all. That's the hidden cost of sudden wealth that nobody warns you about. It's not just the lawsuits or the hangers-on or the reckless spending. It's the slow, corrosive loss of the ability to trust, to connect, to believe that someone might actually care about you for who you are, not what you have. And once that's gone, no amount of money can buy it back. Here's a question most people never have to answer. Who are you when everything you thought defined you is suddenly irrelevant? For most of Jack's life, his identity was clear. He was a businessman, a provider, a husband, a father, a grandfather, a churchgoer, a member of his community. Those roles gave him structure. They told him what to do when he woke up in the morning. They gave him a sense of purpose, a place in the world. And then in one night, all of that changed. He was still technically those things. He was still married, still a father and grandfather, still a businessman. But the roles didn't fit anymore. Because now, layered on top of all of that, was a new identity that overpowered everything else: lottery winner. Those two words became the first thing anyone knew about him, the first thing they said when they introduced him, the lens through which every interaction was filtered. And Jack didn't know how to be that person, because it wasn't a role he'd chosen or trained for. It was a label that had been stamped onto him, and he was expected to figure out what it meant in real time, under the brightest spotlight imaginable. This is what psychologists call identity disruption. It's what happens when the story you've been telling yourself about who you are suddenly stops making sense. And it's one of the most destabilizing things a human being can experience. Because identity isn't just a label. It's the framework you use to make decisions, to interpret experiences, to understand your place in the world. When that framework collapses, everything becomes uncertain. You don't know how to act. You don't know what's expected of you. You don't know who to trust or what to value or what success even means anymore. And the worst part, everyone around you assumes you're fine because you're rich. And rich people aren't supposed to have problems. They're supposed to be happy, free, living the dream. But Jack wasn't living a dream. He was living a nightmare wearing a mask of success. He tried to hold on to his old identity. He kept running his business. He kept going to church. He kept trying to be the same person he'd always been, But it didn't work, because the world wouldn't let him. Every time he walked into a room, he wasn't Jack the businessman. He was Jack the guy who won $315 million, and that distinction mattered more than he ever thought it would. People treated him differently. They deferred to him in ways they hadn't before. They asked his opinion on things he knew nothing about, simply because he was wealthy. They assumed he was smarter, wiser, more capable, and Jack, like most people would, started to believe it. He started to think that maybe the money did mean something, that maybe it was a sign, that maybe he was supposed to be someone bigger, someone more important. This is the trap of inflated identity. When external validation starts to replace internal clarity, you lose touch with who you actually are. You start performing a version of yourself that you think people expect. And over time, the performance becomes exhausting because it's not real. Jack started making decisions that didn't align with who he'd been. He started acting impulsively, throwing money around, testing limits, picking fights, getting into trouble. And every time someone questioned him, he had the same response: "I can afford it." But affordability was never the issue. The issue was meaning, purpose, direction. Jack could afford anything, but he didn't know what he actually wanted or who he actually was anymore. There's a moment in one of his later interviews where the reporter asks him, "If you could go back, would you still buy the ticket?" And Jack doesn't even hesitate. He says, "No, I'd tear it up." The reporter pushes back. "But think of all the good you were able to do, the people you helped, the charity work." And Jack just shakes his head. He says, "It wasn't worth it." That answer tells you everything. Because Jack wasn't just talking about the money he lost, or the legal trouble, or even the deaths of his loved ones. He was talking about the loss of himself. He'd spent 5 years trying to be someone he wasn't. Trying to live up to an identity that was forced on him. Trying to make the money mean something. And in the process, he'd lost sight of the person he'd been before any of this happened. The businessman who took pride in his work. The grandfather who loved spending time with his family. The man who went to church not for recognition, but because it grounded him. That man was gone, and Jack didn't know how to get him back. This is what happens when wealth arrives faster than wisdom. You lose yourself. Not because the money is evil, but because you're not prepared for the identity shift it demands. And without a strong internal foundation, you start building your sense of self on things that can't support it. Validation, status, power, influence. And when those things inevitably fail you, because they always do, you're left with nothing. Jack spent his final years trying to rebuild some version of normalcy. He sold off properties. He settled lawsuits. He tried to distance himself from the chaos, but the damage was done. His family was gone. His fortune was mostly gone. His reputation was tarnished. And his sense of self, the thing that had once been so clear, was fragmented beyond recognition. In 2016, his house burned down. Investigators said it was likely arson, but nothing was ever proven. Jack wasn't home at the time. He'd already moved out, trying to start over somewhere quieter. The house, the one he'd bought with lottery money, the one that was supposed to represent success and stability, was reduced to ash. And in a strange way, it felt symbolic. Because everything the money had built had already burned down long before the fire ever started. Jack Whittaker died in 2020, alone, quietly, far from the headlines that had once followed him everywhere. And the man who had once held a check for $315 million left behind a legacy that had nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with loss. Loss of family, loss of trust, loss of identity, loss of peace. The money didn't kill him, but it revealed every weakness, amplified every flaw and dismantled every structure he'd relied on to hold himself together. And the saddest part, it didn't have to be that way. Let's step back for a moment, because Jack's story, as tragic as it is, isn't unique. It's a pattern. And patterns have structure. They have warning signs. They have predictable stages. If we can understand the architecture of how sudden wealth destroys people, we can start to see those same forces at work in our own lives. Not at the same scale, maybe, but the principles are identical. Because this isn't really about lottery tickets. It's about what happens when external change outpaces internal development. And that can happen to anyone. You get the promotion before you're ready. You inherit money you didn't earn. You sell the business before you've figured out what's next. You achieve the goal you've been chasing and then realize you have no idea who you are without the chase. These are all versions of the same problem, and they all follow a similar path of destruction if you're not careful. Stage 1 is euphoria, the win, the high, the belief that everything is about to get better. Jack felt this. He stood on that stage holding the oversized check, smiling. He felt like the luckiest man alive, and in that moment he was. But euphoria is dangerous because it shuts down your critical thinking. It makes you feel invincible. It makes you believe that the rules that apply to other people don't apply to you. Jack stopped being cautious. He stopped asking for advice. He started trusting his gut, even when his gut had no experience navigating this kind of situation. He thought he could handle it, and that belief, that quiet arrogance that comes with sudden success, is the first crack. Stage 2 is exposure, the moment the world finds out. And with that exposure comes a flood of attention, requests, and expectations. Your phone doesn't stop ringing. Your mailbox fills up. People you haven't spoken to in years suddenly want to reconnect. And you, still riding the euphoria, try to manage it all. You say yes more than you should. You make promises you can't keep. You overextend yourself because you want to be generous, or because you don't want to disappoint people, or because you're still trying to prove that the money hasn't changed you. But it has. It already has. Stage 3 is erosion. The slow, almost imperceptible breakdown of boundaries, relationships, and judgment. You start making decisions you wouldn't have made before. You justify things you would have questioned. You surround yourself with people who tell you what you want to hear instead of what you need to hear. Jack hit this stage hard. The cash in the car, the strip clubs, the impulsive giving, the lawsuits he could have avoided. Every decision made sense to him in the moment, but looking back, they form a clear pattern of deterioration. And the thing about erosion is, you don't notice it happening. You just wake up one day and realize that the person you were is gone and you're not sure when it happened. Stage 4 is crisis. Something breaks. A relationship, a legal issue, a public scandal, a personal tragedy. For Jack, it was Brandy's death. That was the moment everything stopped being manageable. The moment the illusion of control shattered completely. And crisis has a way of exposing everything you've been avoiding. All the unresolved pain, all the unhealed wounds, all the decisions you made that you knew were wrong but didn't want to confront. Stage 5 is collapse, the full unraveling, finances gone, relationships destroyed, identity fractured. This is where Jack ended up. And this is where a lot of people end up when they experience sudden wealth without the internal scaffolding to support it. But here's what's important. This progression isn't inevitable. It's predictable, yes. Common, absolutely, but not inevitable. Because at every stage there are off-ramps. Moments where you can stop, reassess, get help, and change course. Jack had those moments. After the first robbery, he could have hired better security and stopped carrying cash. After the first lawsuit, he could have brought in advisors to create better systems. After Brandy started spiraling, he could have set boundaries instead of enabling her. But he didn't. Not because he was stupid, but because he didn't have the framework to recognize what was happening. He didn't have the language for it. He didn't have people around him who could see the pattern and intervene. And that's the real tragedy. Not that he won the lottery, but that he was alone in trying to navigate something that no one should have to navigate alone. Now let's talk about what actually protects people in these situations. Because there are lottery winners who didn't implode. There are people who receive sudden wealth and manage it well. So what's the difference? The difference is preparation. Not financial preparation, though that helps. Emotional preparation. Psychological preparation. Relational preparation. The people who survive sudden wealth are the ones who already have a strong sense of identity before the money arrives. They know who they are. They know what they value. They have relationships that aren't transactional. They have systems for decision-making. They have boundaries. And when the money comes, they don't let it redefine them. They integrate it into their existing life instead of letting it consume their entire existence. Jack didn't have that. He had business skills, yes, but he didn't have emotional resilience. He didn't have a support system that could handle the pressure. He didn't have boundaries with his family. He didn't have a clear sense of purpose beyond providing and succeeding. So when the money came, it didn't have a container. It just spilled everywhere. And the cleanup was impossible. There's another element that protects people: humility. The ability to say, "I don't know what I'm doing and I need help." Jack never said that. He thought he could figure it out. He thought his business experience would translate. He thought he was smart enough, strong enough, capable enough. And that pride, that refusal to admit he was in over his head, cost him everything. Because here's the truth. No one is prepared for sudden massive wealth. No one. It doesn't matter how smart you are or how successful you've been. This is a different game with different rules. And if you try to play it alone, you will lose. Jack needed a team. Not just financial advisors, but therapists, mentors, people who had been through something similar and could guide him. He needed someone to tell him no. Someone to protect him from himself. But he didn't build that team. And the people who did surround him were either unequipped to help or actively taking advantage. So the architecture of his self-destruction was built on a foundation of isolation, pride, and unexamined trauma. And once that foundation was set, everything that followed was almost inevitable. But it didn't have to be. There's a lie we tell ourselves about money. We say, money changes people. But that's not quite right. Money doesn't change people, it reveals them. It takes whatever was already inside and turns up the volume. If you're generous, you become more generous. If you're insecure, you become more insecure. If you're kind, you become kinder. If you're selfish, you become more selfish. Money is a magnifier, and what it magnifies is character. Jack wasn't a bad person before he won the lottery. He was flawed, like all of us. He had unresolved issues with control. He had a tendency to use money to solve emotional problems. He had trouble setting boundaries with the people he loved. He had a need to be seen as successful, as the provider, as the hero. None of those things were catastrophic when he was a millionaire running a construction company. But when he became a $100-millionaire overnight, those tendencies went from manageable quirks to life-destroying forces. His need for control turned into paranoia. His generosity turned into enabling. His desire to be the hero turned into a savior complex that drained him and the people around him. The money didn't create those patterns. It just gave them infinite fuel. And this is the part that should make all of us uncomfortable. Because we all have patterns. We all have unexamined wounds. We all have parts of ourselves that we've learned to manage in our current circumstances, but haven't actually healed. And if those circumstances change dramatically, if we suddenly have more money, more power, more freedom, those unhealed parts don't stay manageable. They explode. Think about the person who's always been a little controlling. Give them enough money to actually control everything around them, and they become a tyrant. Think about the person who's always sought validation through achievement. Give them sudden success they didn't earn, and they lose their sense of identity entirely. Think about the person who's always avoided conflict by throwing money at problems. Give them unlimited money, and they never learn to have a hard conversation. They just keep paying people to go away. Jack was all of these, and the lottery ticket didn't make him that way. It just removed every obstacle that had been keeping those tendencies in check. Before the lottery, Jack couldn't carry $500,000 in cash because he didn't have it. He couldn't enable Brandy's addiction indefinitely because his resources were limited. He couldn't alienate everyone around him because he needed them, both personally and professionally. But after the lottery, all those natural limits were gone. And without limits, he spiraled. This is why character matters more than capability. This is why self-awareness matters more than strategy. This is why the internal work, the boring, uncomfortable work of examining who you are and why you do what you do, is the most important work you can ever do. Because you can learn to manage money. You can hire advisors. You can create systems. But if you don't know yourself, if you haven't dealt with your wounds, if you haven't built genuine relationships and a strong sense of identity, then no amount of systems will save you. The money will find the cracks. It always does. Let's talk about what Jack's story reveals about the rest of us. Most of us will never win the lottery. We'll never have $100 million, but we will have moments where we're tested, where we get more than we're ready for, more responsibility, more influence, more visibility. And in those moments, the same dynamics apply. If you've been using work to avoid dealing with your marriage, a promotion won't fix that. It'll just give you a better title while your marriage falls apart. If you've been using busyness to avoid dealing with your emotions, more success won't help. It'll just make you busier and more disconnected. If you've been trying to earn love through performance, more achievement won't satisfy you. It'll just raise the bar and leave you exhausted. The patterns follow you. And the higher you climb, the more damage those patterns can do. Jack climbed as high as you can climb financially, and the fall destroyed him. But here's the hope. The reason we're talking about this, the reason this story matters. You don't have to wait for a crisis to do the internal work. You don't have to wait for the money to reveal your weaknesses. You can start now. You can ask yourself the hard questions. Who am I when no one's watching? What am I avoiding? What do I actually value? What wounds am I carrying that I haven't dealt with? What relationships am I keeping alive that should end? What boundaries do I need to set? These questions are uncomfortable, but they're also protective. Because the more you know yourself now, the more prepared you'll be when the test comes. And the test will come. Maybe not in the form of a lottery ticket, but it'll come. And when it does, you want to be someone who can handle it. Someone who has done the work. Someone who knows who they are, what they stand for, and what they won't compromise on. Jack didn't have that, and it cost him everything. But you can. You can be the person who wins and doesn't lose themselves. The person who gets the promotion and stays grounded. The person who inherits the money and uses it wisely. The person who achieves the goal and still knows who they are on the other side. But only if you start now. Only if you do the work before the pressure arrives. Because once the money comes, once the spotlight turns on, once everyone's watching and expecting and demanding, it's too late to build a foundation. You can only stand on the one you already have. Jack's foundation couldn't hold. And the whole structure came down. Make sure yours can. One of the strangest things about sudden wealth is how quickly it sorts people. Not intentionally, not loudly, but efficiently. Within months of winning, Jack's entire social landscape had been reorganized. And he didn't even realize it was happening until it was already done. The people who stayed fell into a few categories. There were the opportunists, the ones who saw him as a resource. They stayed close because proximity meant access. They laughed at his jokes a little too hard. They agreed with him a little too quickly. They never said no. Then there were the professionals, the lawyers, accountants, advisors, people who were paid to be there. They had a role, a contract, a clear transactional relationship. And while some of them genuinely cared, the foundation was still business. If Jack stopped paying, they'd stop showing up. And then there were the ghosts, the people who used to be in his life but quietly disappeared, not because they wanted something and didn't get it, but because they didn't know how to relate to him anymore. Because the friendship had been built on equality, and equality was gone. These were the people Jack missed most, the ones who left not out of malice but out of discomfort, the buddies he used to grab lunch with, the guys from church he used to sit with on Sundays, the neighbors who used to wave from across the yard. They didn't ask him for money, they didn't betray him. They just drifted. And that kind of loss is quiet but devastating, because it's not something you can fix with generosity or apologies. It's structural. The relationship doesn't fit anymore. Jack tried to keep some of those friendships alive. He'd call. He'd invite people out. He'd offer to pay for dinner, for trips, for experiences. But every gesture, no matter how genuine, reinforced the imbalance. He was the one with the money. He was the one reaching down. And that dynamic, once it sets in, is almost impossible to reverse. Equality is fragile, and money shatters it. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with wealth. It's not the loneliness of being alone. It's the loneliness of being surrounded by people who don't really see you, who see the money first and maybe, if you're lucky, the person second. Jack felt that. In interviews, you can hear it in his voice. The exhaustion, the resignation, the knowledge that he'd lost something he could never get back. He'd gained financial freedom and lost relational intimacy. And the trade, in hindsight, wasn't even close. But here's the part that's harder to talk about. Sometimes the people you lose are the ones you needed to lose. Not everyone in Jack's life before the lottery was healthy. Not every friendship was built on something real. Some of those relationships were held together by convenience, proximity, or shared circumstances. And when the money came, it exposed that. The friends who only showed up when they needed something weren't new. They'd always been that way. Jack just hadn't noticed because the asks were smaller. A favor here, a loan there, nothing that seemed significant. But when the stakes went up, the pattern became obvious. And that's one of the few gifts sudden wealth can offer. Clarity. It shows you who people really are. It reveals motives that were always there but hidden under the surface of normal life. The problem is, most people aren't ready for that clarity. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And it changes how you view everyone. Jack started viewing everyone through a lens of suspicion. And while some of that suspicion was justified, it also cost him the few relationships that might have been real. Because when you assume everyone wants something, you push away the people who don't. You create distance where there didn't need to be any. You protect yourself so aggressively that you end up alone, even when you didn't have to be. This is the trap. Wealth makes trust harder, but without trust, connection is impossible. And without connection, wealth becomes a prison. Jack had all the money in the world and no one to share it with. Not really. Not in a way that felt genuine. His wife was still there, technically, but the intimacy was gone. They were cohabitating, not connecting. They were managing logistics, not building a life. His daughter was struggling with her own demons, and Jack didn't know how to reach her. Every conversation was surface level. Every attempt to help was transactional. His granddaughter was gone, and his friends, the real ones, had either drifted away or been pushed away by Jack's own inability to trust. So he sat in his big house, surrounded by things, and felt nothing. There's a concept in psychology called hedonic adaptation. It's the idea that humans quickly return to a baseline level of happiness, regardless of positive or negative changes in their life. You buy the dream house and for a few weeks it feels amazing, but then it just becomes your house. The thrill fades, the normalcy returns, and you're left chasing the next thing, hoping it'll bring back that feeling. Jack experienced this in real time. The cars, the houses, the toys, they all lost their shine almost immediately, because things can't fill the void that relationships leave. And once you've lost the people who actually mattered, no amount of stuff will ever feel like enough. But there's another side to this. The people who stayed for the wrong reasons. Jack had no shortage of new friends after the lottery. People who wanted to be seen with him, who wanted to say they knew the guy who won all that money, who wanted access to his world, his resources, his influence. These people were easy to spot but hard to reject, because when you're lonely, even shallow company feels better than none. So Jack let them in. He partied with them. He funded their ideas. He laughed at their jokes. And for brief moments, it felt like connection. But it wasn't. It was performance, on both sides. They performed interest in him. He performed happiness. And everyone pretended it was real until the money ran out or the usefulness expired. This is what happens when you build relationships on a foundation of wealth. They're conditionally stable at best. The moment the condition changes, the relationship evaporates. And Jack knew that. Deep down, he knew. But admitting it would have meant confronting just how alone he really was. So he kept the charade going as long as he could, until he couldn't anymore. By the end, Jack had very few people left, and the ones who remained were mostly there out of obligation or professional duty. He'd lost his granddaughter, his daughter, his wife emotionally if not legally, his real friends, his sense of community. He had money for a while. But even that was gone by the end. And what he was left with was the haunting realization that the most valuable things in life, the things that actually make life worth living, can't be bought. And once you lose them, you can't buy them back either. The people you lose when wealth arrives aren't always the ones you'd expect. Sometimes they're the opportunists, yes, but sometimes they're the ones who loved you most and just didn't know how to navigate the new version of you. And the people you keep aren't always the ones you should. Sometimes they're parasites. Sometimes they're enablers. Sometimes they're just filling space so you don't have to feel the weight of your own isolation. Jack lost the wrong people and kept the wrong people. And by the time he realized it, there was no one left to help him find his way back. There's a line that gets thrown around in wealth psychology circles. It's from Oscar Wilde. Nowadays, people know the price of everything and the value of nothing. Jack Whittaker became the living embodiment of that line. He could tell you what everything cost. The cars, the houses, the legal fees, the settlements, the donations. He knew the numbers. He tracked the outflows. He watched his fortune shrink. But he had no idea what any of it was worth. Because price and value are not the same thing. Price is what you pay. Value is what you get. And when you're operating in a state of emotional chaos, you end up paying enormous prices for things that have no value at all. Jack spent millions on things that didn't matter, settlements to make problems go away, gifts to people who didn't appreciate them, experiences that left him emptier than before. He paid for loyalty that wasn't real, for friendships that were transactional, for love that was conditional. And the saddest part is, the things that actually had value, the things that could have saved him, were often free. Or at least they didn't require money. A real conversation with his wife, genuine time with his granddaughter that wasn't about buying her things, therapy, accountability, boundaries, community. These things require vulnerability, not wealth. They require presence, not presence. And Jack, like a lot of people who suddenly find themselves with resources, confused the two. He thought money could solve problems, and it can sometimes. It can solve logistical problems. It can remove obstacles. It can create opportunities. But it can't solve emotional problems. It can't heal trauma. It can't create intimacy. It can't build character. And when you try to use it for those things, you end up wasting it. Or worse, you end up making the problems deeper. Jack gave Brandy money every time she was in trouble. And every time it taught her that she didn't have to face consequences. That someone would always bail her out. That money was the solution to everything. And that lesson, repeated over and over, contributed to her death. Not directly. Jack didn't kill her. But he enabled a lifestyle that made survival almost impossible. And he did it because he loved her, because he wanted to help, because he thought that's what grandfathers with money were supposed to do. But love without boundaries isn't love. It's harm dressed up as care. And the cost of that mistake wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in a life. A young life that never got the chance to develop resilience, responsibility, or the strength to face her own demons. Jack paid for everything, but he gave her nothing of value. The same pattern played out in his other relationships. He funded his daughter's life, but he didn't give her the emotional support she needed. He donated to his church, but he didn't invest in genuine spiritual community. He hired people to manage his money, but he didn't build relationships with mentors who could manage him. Everything had a price. Nothing had value. And by the time he realized the difference, it was too late. There's a moment in one of Jack's final interviews where he's asked what he would tell someone who just won the lottery. He doesn't hesitate. He says, "Get a lawyer, get an accountant, and don't tell anyone." The reporter laughs, thinks he's joking, but Jack's face is stone serious. "I mean it," he says. "The money will destroy you if you let people know. It'll destroy your relationships. It'll destroy your peace. It'll destroy everything you thought mattered." And then he pauses, and he says something that should be carved into every lottery ticket ever printed. "The money didn't make me happy. It didn't make my life better, it just made everything louder. And when everything's loud, you can't hear the things that actually matter." That's the core of it, the noise. Sudden wealth creates noise, opinions, requests, offers, threats, opportunities, distractions. And in the middle of all that noise, the quiet things, the things that give life meaning, get drowned out. Time with family, simple routines, honest work, genuine laughter, quiet reflection. These things don't announce themselves. They don't demand attention. They're easy to ignore when there's always something louder competing for your focus. And Jack ignored them, not on purpose, but consistently. And by the time the noise died down, there was nothing left. He'd spent his whole fortune, not all at once, not recklessly by his own accounting, but steadily. Lawsuits, settlements, loans that were never repaid, gifts, donations, theft, bad investments, the cost of living a life under siege. And when the money was gone, he looked around and realized he had nothing to show for it. No stronger relationships, no deeper sense of purpose. No legacy he was proud of, just a trail of wreckage and a name that had become synonymous with cautionary tales. The man who won $315 million ended up with less than he started with, not just financially, emotionally, relationally, spiritually. He lost his granddaughter, his daughter, his wife, his friends, his reputation, his peace. And in the end, he was left with a single truth that he wished he'd understood from the beginning. The value of a life isn't measured by what you have. It's measured by who you are and who you're connected to. And no amount of money can change that. Jack spent years trying to buy value, trying to purchase meaning, trying to use wealth to fill the holes that only love, purpose, and connection can fill. And it didn't work. It never works. Because the things that matter most in life, the things that make waking up worthwhile, can't be bought. They can only be built, slowly, intentionally, with presence and patience and humility. And if you don't build them before the money comes, the money won't build them for you. It'll just reveal that they were never there in the first place. Jack's story is a mirror, and if you look closely, you'll see yourself in it. Not because you're going to win the lottery, but because we're all tempted to believe that external success will create internal peace. That the next promotion will make us feel fulfilled. That the bigger house will make us feel secure. That the recognition will make us feel worthy. But it won't. It never does. Because peace doesn't come from what you have. It comes from who you are. And if you don't know who you are, if you haven't done the work to build a solid identity and genuine relationships, then success, however it arrives, will only make things worse. Jack learned that the hardest way possible. You don't have to. Jack Whittaker's story doesn't end with a dramatic final scene. There's no Hollywood moment of redemption, no tearful reconciliation, no sudden clarity that fixes everything. It ends quietly, the way most tragedies do. He lived his final years in relative obscurity. The cameras stopped following him. The headlines moved on. The lawsuits settled or faded. The fortune was gone. The people were gone. And Jack, the man who had once been the center of the biggest lottery story in American history, became just another elderly man trying to make sense of what his life had become. In interviews near the end, there's a heaviness to him that's hard to watch. Not anger, not bitterness, just a deep, bone-tired sadness. The kind that comes from carrying regret for so long that it becomes part of your posture. He'd say things like, "I wish it never happened." And you could tell he meant it, not in a hypothetical way, not as a figure of speech, but as a genuine, aching wish that he could go back to Christmas 2002 and make a different choice. But you can't go back. None of us can. We can only move forward with the lessons we've learned and try to do better with whatever time we have left. Jack tried. In his own way, he distanced himself from the chaos. He stopped giving interviews for a while. He tried to rebuild some sense of normalcy. But the damage was too deep, the losses too profound. And the man who emerged from the wreckage wasn't the man who went in. He died in 2020. The obituaries were brief, respectful but detached. They mentioned the lottery win. They mentioned the tragedies. But they couldn't capture the full weight of what had happened. How do you summarize a life like that in a few paragraphs? You can't. So we do what we always do with cautionary tales. We reduce them to lessons. We extract the teachable moments. We say, "Don't let this happen to you," and then we move on. But Jack's story deserves more than that, because it's not just a warning. It's a window, a glimpse into the deepest vulnerabilities of the human condition. It shows us what happens when we build our lives on unstable foundations, when we pursue wealth without wisdom, when we confuse external validation with internal worth, when we let money become a substitute for the hard, uncomfortable work of knowing ourselves and building real relationships. And it shows us that no amount of money can save you from yourself. Jack had every material advantage. He could afford the best lawyers, the best advisors, the best security. He could have bought himself time, space, help, but he couldn't buy the one thing he actually needed: self-awareness, emotional resilience, the ability to say no, the courage to ask for help, the humility to admit he was in over his head. Those things can't be purchased. They have to be developed. And if you don't develop them before the pressure arrives, the pressure will destroy you. That's the lesson. Not that money is evil, not that lottery winners are doomed, but that character is the only thing that actually protects you when your circumstances change. If your identity is built on your net worth, what happens when the net worth disappears? If your relationships are built on what you can provide, what happens when you can't provide anymore? If your sense of control comes from external circumstances, what happens when those circumstances spiral beyond your control? You collapse, just like Jack did, but it doesn't have to be that way. There are people who have won the lottery and lived quiet, stable, fulfilling lives. People who took the money, set up proper structures, maintained their boundaries, and didn't let it define them. The difference wasn't luck. It was preparation, internal preparation. They knew who they were before the money came. They had strong relationships that weren't based on transactions. They had mentors, therapists, advisors they actually listened to. They had the humility to admit they didn't have all the answers. And because of that, the money integrated into their lives instead of consuming them. Jack didn't have that. And it's not entirely his fault. He was a product of his generation, his upbringing, his circumstances. He did the best he could with what he knew, but the tragedy is that what he knew wasn't enough. And by the time he realized it, the damage was irreversible. So what do we do with a story like this? We honor it by learning from it, by recognizing the patterns in our own lives before they become catastrophic, by doing the internal work now while the stakes are still manageable. Ask yourself, who am I when no one's watching? What am I avoiding? What relationships am I keeping alive that I know aren't healthy? What boundaries do I need to set but haven't? What wounds am I carrying that I've never dealt with? These aren't comfortable questions, but they're necessary. Because if you wait until the crisis to ask them, it'll be too late. The work has to happen now, in the ordinary moments, in the small decisions, in the daily practice of being honest with yourself about who you are and who you want to become. Because one day you're going to be tested, maybe not with a lottery ticket, but with something, a promotion, an inheritance, a success you weren't expecting, a failure that knocks you sideways, and in that moment you won't rise to the occasion. You'll default to the systems you've already built, the habits you've already formed, the character you've already developed. Jack defaulted to chaos because that's what was underneath, and the money just made it visible. What's underneath for you? That's the question this story should leave you with. Not, what would I do if I won the lottery? But, am I building a foundation that can actually support the life I say I want? Because if you're not, then success, however it arrives, will break you. Not because success is bad, but because you're not ready for it. Jack wasn't ready, and it cost him everything. But you can be. You can be the person who wins and stays whole, who achieves and stays grounded, who accumulates and stays generous, who rises and stays humble, but only if you do the work, only if you build the foundation, only if you prioritize character over capability, relationships over resources, and meaning over money. Jack's $315 million mistake wasn't buying the ticket. It was believing that the money mattered more than the man. Don't make the same mistake. Build yourself first. Know yourself deeply. Surround yourself with people who see you, not what you have. Create boundaries that protect your peace. Develop the humility to ask for help and the wisdom to accept it. Do that, and when the test comes, you'll be ready. And if the test never comes, you'll still have built a life worth living. Because in the end, that's all any of us really have. Not what we accumulate, not what we achieve, but who we become and who we love along the way. Jack lost sight of that. And it destroyed him. Don't let it destroy you. Take care of your character and it will take care of your wealth. Take care of your relationships and they'll take care of your soul. Take care of the small things now and the big things won't break you later. And if you ever find yourself holding a ticket, literal or metaphorical, that promises to change your life overnight, remember Jack. Remember that the money won't change you. It'll reveal you. And make sure that what it reveals is someone you're proud to be. Before we close, I want to leave you with one question. Not for me, for you. If everything external was stripped away tomorrow, the job, the house, the status, the accounts, who would you be? Would you still know yourself? Would you still have people who love you for you? Would you still have a sense of purpose? If the answer is yes, you're building on solid ground. Keep going. If the answer is no, or if you're not sure, then the work starts now. Not tomorrow, not when things calm down. Now. Because the foundation you build in the quiet will determine whether you survive the storm. Jack's storm destroyed him, but yours doesn't have to destroy you. Learn from his story. Honor his pain by not repeating his mistakes. And build a life that's strong enough to hold whatever comes next. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What stood out? What challenged you? What are you going to do differently because of what you heard today? And if you found value in this, there are more stories like it here on Asset Audiobooks. Real stories, hard lessons, the kind of financial and psychological truths that most people don't talk about but everyone needs to hear. Subscribe if you haven't already. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, take care of your money and it will take care of you. But more importantly, take care of yourself first. Because without that, the money means nothing. I'll see you in the next one.